Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D RPG about a marine biologist trying to save the ocean and its inhabitants. I'm joining you on the morning of Wednesday, July the 13th. I'm just on the tail end now of over a week spent traveling up and down the East Coast from Virginia all the way to Maine to visit family in both of those states. I had a really nice time away from the computer, spent a lot of time outside, and just enjoyed a bit of a break over the past week. We've been back home for just over a day at this point, so I'm feeling settled back in and ready to jump back into Dauphin development. From the last episode, you might recall we started building out a stamina system for the player, and this kind of manifests itself in a stamina bar here in the top left corner. As the player is moving around, if we press the shift key, the player will speed up, and as we're holding the shift key, that stamina bar will deplete. Once we let go, it'll kind of wait for a second and then start to recharge at a pretty slow pace. This is a very basic stamina system that works both above water when you're running around and underwater while you're swimming. As I often do between videos, I've just spent some time kind of cleaning up the code associated with that system and also adding some small nice to haves, my favorite of which is a little particle that shoots up when you actually initiate a sprint for the first time from the player's feet there. I think the stamina system could still use some work, but as I sat down to kind of plan out what I wanted to work on this week, I realized I wanted to change gears and tackle something that's been on my backlog for quite a while at this point. Y'all know by this point that a core part of Dauphin's gameplay is cleansing corruption from living organisms on the Earth. This is what that corruption looks like right now. It's basically a shader that I apply to living organisms that kind of adds this purplish color, and of course these kind of particles that mysteriously float up from the organisms themselves when they're corrupted. I think this looks okay and has generally been a good start to the corruption system. That said, once we kind of zoom out on my entire demo island here, you'll see that the island itself does not look like it's gripped by this corruption. Instead, it's just dotted by funny looking trees and bushes. What I want to achieve here is the feeling that this corruption has spread across the entire island and has a chokehold on all the organisms that exist here. That will only be lifted by the player going around and saving these organisms. To start solving this problem, yesterday I began work on a new shader that I plan to use to show corruption spreading on the ground. This is actually a pretty cool effect, as you can see here. It combines a kind of animated purlin noise effect with a very basic pixelation to create the kind of effect of an oozing, kind of undulating puddle of corruption on the ground. Almost all the code for this effect came from two shaders that I found on a really cool website called godotshaders.com. I started with this 2D procedural water shader to do the purlin noise calculation, and then passed it through a pixelation algorithm and of course applied my corruption color scheme. I definitely recommend checking out this website. There's a bunch of really cool stuff on here, and it's a great learning experience if, like me, shaders are still kind of a new thing for you. If you are browsing shaders on here and using some of the code, definitely be mindful of the license that each shader has. Thankfully, both of the ones I've used are Creative Commons 0 licensed, but if the license is a bit more restrictive, you should be mindful of how you're using the code. If I just blindly slap this effect onto my existing corrupted organisms, you can already see we're off to a good start here. It kind of pulses across the ground and spreads between nearby organisms, or at least it looks that way. And overall, I think we're making a good start towards achieving the effect of having corruption spreading across the ground of the entire island and making the island itself feel more corrupted. These enhancements to the corruption system are what I'm going to be working on for the remainder of the week here, and I've kind of organized those into two buckets. I'm going to start with corruption for static organisms like the trees and bushes, and as I tackle those, I want to make sure I can create these ground effects with variable sizes and shapes, randomized values for the noise algorithm so that not all effects look exactly the same, and maybe even introduce varying colors. The trickier part of this is going to be showing a trail of corruption behind organisms that can move. That corruption may or may not have a lifetime. Maybe the player will have to cleanse it in order for it to go away, but I'd also like for that corruption to do corruption damage to the player or other organisms that step through it. I think this is going to be a lot of fun to build out, and honestly, it will have a huge impact on the way that Dauphin looks and feels, especially as you are exploring an island that is just totally choked by corruption, so I'm really excited to see how it turns out. For now, it is going on 7 a.m., time to grab some coffee and get to work. Hey everyone, quick update here on Friday morning now that I've made a bit of progress on this new corruption visual. You can see in the engine here that I'm working on a new scene called the corruption trail, and this file right now only does kind of two simple things. It controls the size and the parameters of the corruption shader that we've been looking at. So the size here is defined in this corruption trail size enum, and you can see I have a bunch of different sizes that we'll be applying to organisms of different sizes. Apart from just the size of the image, we also do some randomization to our shader parameters here, just to change kind of some of the various parameters associated with the Perlin noise to make different instances of this shader look different. So this all comes together when this scene is initialized. The first thing we do is load the correctly sized image based on what we've chosen in the editor, and then load the shader, which just duplicates it to make sure that we're not kind of using any shared materials here, and then performing some randomization. Back on the beach, we can see the effect this has in practice. Looking at the various trees here, we can see that each of their shaders are behaving a bit differently. Some kind of move to the left, some move to the right, some move very slowly, and some of them have kind of different maybe widths, I would say, of the various details created by the noise. Overall, it's a nice effect, and if you zoom out, you'll notice that the increased size of this effect on the trees kind of at least is moving in the right direction towards showing how this corruption is spreading across the island. As we're just at the beginning stages of this effect right now, I'd love to hear what y'all think down in the comments. My first impression after looking at this is that it all kind of looks a bit too circular. It makes sense that this might be kind of chaining out in different directions instead of being a perfect oval underneath a tree. But that's something that I think might be kind of hard to implement. I don't have a great idea for how to do that yet. Apart from that, I think this is a good start. I love the way the colors look, and I kind of need to hook this up to the corruption system now to make sure that non-corrupted trees, or perhaps less corrupted trees or organisms, don't show this effect in such an intense way. That's where I'll be focusing my efforts next, but for now it is unfortunately time to get ready for work again. I'm hoping this weekend I'll have a lot more time to work on this concept, so we will catch up hopefully tomorrow and see what we can knock out. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Sunday morning. I know we skipped right over Saturday, which was not ideal, but that was not without good reason. Yesterday was a very busy but very productive day for me. I woke up, worked out, took the morning shift with the puppy, then just spent the day kind of running a bunch of errands and doing chores, after which I was very tired, ended up just playing a round of disc golf and then kind of relaxing for the evening. One of the fun parts of yesterday was heading to my local fish store to pick up the new critters sponsored by new Patreon supporters. Those names are up on the screen now, and I want to give a special shout out to Cody Oden. He's been one of my longest time supporters. Thanks, Cody, for sticking with me for so long. The way this normally works is that for each new or modified pledge, I'll purchase a single cherry shrimp to go in the 5-gallon aquarium on my desk. This time I decided to do something a little bit different. There has not been a lot of breeding activity in this 5-gallon, which I was hoping for, but there has been a ton in the 10-gallon I have next door here. So what I've done is moved all the shrimp into the 10-gallon to continue building that colony and make the 5-gallon home to a brand new critter. This little fella here is named Kapora. He is the first betta fish I've ever owned. I picked him up yesterday and I am kind of amazed by how beautiful and elegant he is. Definitely one of the most interesting creatures I've ever had in one of these aquariums, and I think one of the smartest just based on sitting here at my desk and staring at him all day. I'm happy to say that after the first 24 hours in his new home, he is very active, eating well, and just a really cool little buddy to have here on my desk watching me as I work. Speaking of work, I have actually found some time this morning to make some progress on my corruption ground visuals. As I mentioned before, I didn't really like having the pool of corruption directly below a given organism. It just didn't look very natural and a little bit too perfectly placed. So what I've been building this morning is the beginnings of a corruption pool spawner. And what this does is use a very basic implementation of object pooling to kind of keep in memory a little collection of these corruption pools, and on a timer decide when we want to spawn those in a random radius around a given object. The bulk of this logic so far is pretty much just these 40 or so lines of code we're looking at here. When this corruption pool spawner is first ready, the first thing we do is prepare the object pool, which basically just means looping through our user-defined object pool size and creating that many instances of our corruption pool scene. This will keep those instances ready for use in memory so that we're not doing a bunch of allocation and deallocation at runtime. Once we have that object pool set up, we're ready to spawn a pool from it, which I'm actually calling from a timer here. All this does is grab one of those instances from the array, make sure it is in the world, and then configure it and place it where we want. The end result of this, as you can see, is far from perfect, but is a pretty good work in progress here. The moving crabs no longer have this weird kind of circle following directly underneath them, but instead they leave these kind of pools near them as they're moving around. And similarly, you can see the kind of effect of multiple pools being spawned around these static objects. It almost looks, especially in some of these cases, like the corruption is spreading between them, which is closer to the effect I'm looking for. In its current state, you can see that the spawning of the pools is very kind of snappy and unnatural, and of course we've lost all the variability between the pools themselves. They're all the same size and showing the same shader effects. So that's all I'll be working on next. For now, it is time to knock out my only Sunday chore, which is mowing the lawn and weed eating. So I'm going to go knock that out, probably take a little break afterwards, then jump back in the afternoon. Alright y'all, welcome back to Thursday morning. Over the past couple days, whenever I've found time, I've continued to work on the system that's responsible for spawning my corruption pools here, and I think I've got a few nice updates to share. As we are zoomed out on our island here, hopefully you can tell I've made a few improvements to the way these pools look on the ground. The first change I made was to ensure that we're spawning pools of multiple sizes below a given organism, and that's probably easiest to see maybe with this tree right here. You can tell that two of the pools spawned by this tree are kind of larger, these two on the left, and the two on the right are a bit smaller. And what that ultimately means in an especially dense area like the forest here is that the corruption that's spread on the ground just looks a little bit less uniform, less circular. It almost looks like little clouds that are formed by these ovals of different shapes. And you can especially tell that in this area here, and I just think that looks a whole lot better. The second change I've made is to create a flag for whether or not an organism should spawn their corruption pools in a static or dynamic way. An example of the static way is for trees and bushes here. Right when these organisms first load into the scene, they will spawn all the corruption pools that are allocated into their object pool, and those will spawn right away and kind of create this larger ground cover effect that we're looking for. If we come over here and manage to find a crab here, you'll notice that he does not have a pool directly underneath him at a given time. Instead, he kind of spawns these on a timer as he moves around. There's still clearly a bit of a bug right there where it's flashing when it first spawns, but this is an example of a dynamic pool spawn. So the idea is that this guy leaves pools on the ground as he travels around the map, and of course those are also of different sizes. If I'm being honest, by this point in the week I was hoping to have this system a lot more complete and polished than it is now, but that's the way it goes. The one change I do have remaining that's probably the most important is to actually hook up these pools to the corruption systems of the individual organisms, so that when organisms are very corrupted, the size of their object pool increases, and when corruption is removed from them, they no longer have pools to spawn, and the island can start to look a bit cleaner. I'm going to see if I can jump back in before work this morning and hopefully have one final update before the weekend. Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome back to Sunday afternoon just after 4 p.m. Obviously, I did not make my deadline of getting this video out yesterday, but that's okay. I actually had a pretty tight schedule on Friday since we took a half day to basically kick off another weekend of travel to go visit some more family for a baby shower. We had a great time, and we got back last night very late, but the good news is that we kind of took the morning today to knock out chores, and this afternoon I have wrapped up all the remaining development tasks for the corruption pool spawning. The bulk of the work I knocked out this morning was to connect the corruption pool spawner to an organism's corruption node itself. And the purpose of this is to help the corruption node communicate to the pool spawner when its corruption level changes. When a corruption node actually has its corruption percentage change, it calls update corruption percentage on its child corruption pool spawner. We keep a track of that value here, and then we call a private function called update pools. What we do in update pools is basically look at the percentage of the initial pools that we want to spawn and change that based on the corruption percentage. So if our corruption percentage is 50%, we'll only show half of the initial pools that we intended on showing. The way we do this is just through looping through the pools and disabling the ones we don't want and despawning the newly disabled pools. Now obviously that was a pretty small code change, but once I actually got into the game to test it, I was frankly shocked by how much of a difference it makes to gameplay. So obviously we're hanging out here in the forest with a bunch of corrupted organisms, and once we start to cleanse corruption from these trees, it just has a profound effect on kind of cleaning up the ground and removing all of this purple. So if I just kind of run around here, attack these trees and bushes to remove corruption, we're left with a much more vibrant looking scene. And this was just kind of a big moment for me once I realized that we were really starting to hone in on the idea of removing a kind of nasty, unsettling corruption from a natural, beautiful place. This whole system actually works really nicely underwater as well. You can see that the jellyfish are spawning these circular pools of corruption in the water as they swim, and once we cleanse those jellyfish of corruption, those pools disappear. And similarly, on the ocean floor, our flora spawn corruption pools as well. And what's interesting to note about these is that I'm using a more oval-shaped pattern for the corruption because we're kind of dealing with a perspective shift underwater, kind of side on as opposed to top down. And of course, just like the forest, once we go through and remove that corruption, we're left with a much nicer looking, brighter scene under the ocean. I hope y'all think this is as cool as I do, and I'd love to hear what you think about these new effects down in the comments. Ultimately, over the course of the past week and a half, this was a shockingly small amount of code and art to get this working, but the effect that it has on the kind of whole idea behind the gameplay of Dauphin is huge, and I wish I had implemented it sooner. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to the folks supporting Dauphin's development and this channel on Patreon. This month's Garami supporters are Mega Ombre, Samuel SVD, Jess Zargo, Binary Chef, and Kyle Van Riper. Beta supporters this month, even more relevant now thanks to the addition of Kapora to our family, are Cody Odin, Vlad Sunny, Delius, Happy Hippie, and Void. Thank y'all for joining me for another episode. Obviously, I'm still trying to figure out how to get back to my ideal upload schedule with everything that's going on in life right now. But in the meantime, please know that development on Dauphin is not stopping, and I am as grateful as ever to have y'all along with me on this journey. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next episode.